right, I believe we have, I think our participant numbers have about leveled off coming in. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for finding the time to attend the Illinois Solar for All program evaluation webinar. My name is Jennifer Schmidt, and I am the program manager for Illinois Solar for All with the Illinois Power Agency. Today's session is being recorded. A recorded version of this session will be available on the IPA website under the events, along with the PDF of the presentation slides this afternoon. To reduce any background noise, all participants are muted upon entry. Please feel free to ask questions at any time during the webinar. We'll reserve some time towards the end of the presentation, as well as occasionally throughout the presentation, so that we can address these questions. To submit the questions, just please use the chat feature at the bottom of the Zoom window. We have also enabled live transcript for the meeting today. If you wish to hide the live transcript, you may click on the live transcript button and then hide subtitle. In today's webinar, we are going to be covering the evaluation of the Illinois Solar for All program. Jackie Berger from Apprise Incorporated is going to be presenting the results of 2 years of evaluation of the development and first 3 program years of Illinois Solar for All. I'm really excited about having this webinar at this time because as the IPA is going into update of our long-term plan, this is a really good background to have as context for how we shape Illinois Solar for All moving forward. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Jackie Berger, President and co-founder of Apprise Incorporated.
Good afternoon. Thank you for that introduction, Jen. As Jen noted, I'll be talking about our evaluation of the Illinois Solar for All program. For those of you who attended the Power Hour on Friday that talked about the impact of the new legislation on Illinois Solar for All, the beginning of this presentation will be a little bit of a repeat. However, I'm going to be going into a lot more detail about the evaluation. The other thing to note is that this is a short presentation, given the number of pages of evaluation reports that are available. So if you're interested in seeing more detail about the research that was conducted, the research findings, detailed methodology about our calculations, all of the evaluation reports are available on the Illinois Solar for All website, and I'll be providing a link to that later in the presentation. Next slide. So here I have an overview of what I'll be covering today. I'll be providing a brief overview of the Illinois Solar for All program, and then I'll talk about the evaluation research that we conducted and a summary of all of the activities and the reports that we provided. I'll go into some detail on the metrics, including the approved vendors, the projects that were selected and constructed, program production, and the impacts of the program. And then I'll conclude with the evaluation recommendations with respect to program design, partnerships, and implementation. Next slide. Okay, so I'll start with the introduction. I just wanted to give a little bit of an overview about Apprise. Apprise is a nonprofit research institute in Princeton, New Jersey. We were established in 2002, and we do research across the country. Our mission is to analyze data and information to assess and improve public programs. And our work focuses on energy efficiency and renewable energy programs for residential customers, low and moderate income customers, and commercial and industrial customers, and also energy affordability programs for low-income households. Our work is for the federal government, the Department of Energy, and the Department of Health and Human Services. Apprise does a lot of work on the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program. And we also conducted an evaluation of the National Weatherization Assistance Program. We do work for state government agencies around the country that manage energy efficiency and energy affordability programs, for utility companies, and also for nonprofit organizations. Next slide. A little bit about the Illinois Solar for All program. This program was mandated by the Future Energy Jobs Act of 2017. And the objectives are to maximize the development of new PV generating facilities, create a long-term low-income solar marketplace throughout the state, integrate with existing energy efficiency initiatives, and minimize administrative costs. This evaluation that I'll be talking about today started in August of 2019 and went through June of 2021. The evaluation measures the program impacts, assesses program barriers and opportunities, and makes recommendations for program changes to achieve greater impacts from the program. Next slide. A little bit of an overview of the Illinois Solar for All program. Next slide. As I mentioned, the Future Energy Jobs Act mandated the Illinois Solar for All program to bring photovoltaics to low-income communities in Illinois. An important part of this is to integrate with existing energy efficiency initiatives. Part of the reason for that is that it's important to make a home energy efficient before installing solar. And another part is that by providing this coordination, it's possible to identify households that are ready and able to have solar installed on their homes. FEJA also required an independent evaluation with criteria that was developed through a stakeholder process. Many of the details of the program were developed in the long-term Renewable Resources Procurement Plan. One item that was spelled out was the economic benefits. And what's specified is that there are no upfront costs for participants and that ongoing payments are less than 50% of the estimated value of energy production. The program does not provide funding for roof repair, wiring, or other needed repairs to install solar on low-income homes. And this is a common issue that is found in low and moderate income distributed generation programs around the country. The incentive REC payments are based upon 15 years of REC production. And a second revised long-term renewable resources procurement plan will be released by January 13th, 2022. And this revised plan will incorporate changes that were dictated in the most recent legislation. Illinois Solar for All is funded through the Renewable Energy Resources Fund and through utility funds that are collected through the Renewable Portfolio Standard Tariffs. The Renewable Energy Resource funding is up to $20 million per year for 7 to 8 years, and the utility funding was $10 to $11.7 million annually. However, that funding will increase to up to $50 million annually with the 2021 Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. Next slide. Within Illinois Solar for All, there are 4 sub-programs. Low-income distributed generation, and this is solar for single-family homes and multifamily buildings. And the participants receive benefits through net metering or reduction of energy costs. This is the program that has been undersubscribed as the approved vendors have faced challenges in the program with the requirements and finding eligible participants. Low-income community solar are subscriptions to a share of a PV project, and participants receive credits on their electric bill. This program has been oversubscribed and several large projects have been selected. The Nonprofit and Public Facilities Program provides on-site PV generation for facilities within low-income communities or environmental justice census tracts that provide critical services to the communities. And the Low-Income Community Solar Pilot Projects is a competitive procurement approach based only on the price for REC delivery. And there was one procurement for the Low-Income Community Solar Pilot Projects, but this subprogram will not be continued under the new legislation. Next slide. Illinois Solar for All does require job trainees on the jobs across an approved vendor's portfolio of projects. The project annual installations must include 10% of hours from qualified job trainees in year 1, and that increases to 20% in year 2 and 1/3 in year 3. Additionally, 1/3 of all distributed generation projects annually must include at least one qualified job trainee. And there are additional requirements in the new legislation. The part of the right slide summarizes the program implementation. There were 4 project selections in August 2019, September to October 2019, September to October 2020, and August to October 2021. Additionally, there was one low-income community solar pilot project bid and contracts in December of 2019. Next slide. So before I move on to the evaluation part of this presentation, are there any questions about the material that I've presented so far?
Haven't seen any questions in the chat yet.
Okay, so let's move on to the evaluation. Next slide, please. There were 6 evaluation reports that were released, and they're all available on the Illinois Solar for All website at the link located at the bottom of this slide. The first report, the Phase 1 final report, was released in October 2019, just a few months after the evaluation began. And the purpose of that report was to provide recommendations for consideration in the first revision of the plan. Then there were 3 interim evaluation reports in April 2020, August 2020, and April 2021. And then in October of this year, the Phase 2 final report was released, as well as a summary report that really provides a very brief overview of the research that was conducted and the evaluation findings. Next slide, please. This slide provides an overview of the evaluation research that was conducted as part of each of the evaluation reports. You can see that each report included a document and materials review. So we looked at all of the materials that were included, from the approved vendor manual to the website, to the portal, to the requirements. And that informed us in terms of our understanding of the program and how the program was communicated to all of the relevant stakeholders. A large part of the evaluation was based upon interviews with many different program actors. We talked to managers and staff in the Illinois Power Agency to develop a full understanding of the program and the nuances of the program and challenges that were faced in implementation. We spoke to Elevate at each stage of the evaluation to understand what level of implementation had been reached, what challenges had been faced, and what steps were being taken to overcome those challenges. Throughout the evaluation, we also talked to stakeholders. In Phase 1, we just talked to the participating stakeholders, But in other stages of the evaluation, we reached out to non-participating stakeholders to understand whether there were points of view that were being missed when seeking feedback on the program and its implementation. The stakeholders provided important comments on how they viewed the program and what changes they felt should be made. Another thing that came apparent when we were talking to the stakeholders was that much of the outreach was conducted via email blasts, and that additional, more proactive outreach to stakeholder groups such as low-income organizations that serve low-income households would have been helpful to get additional feedback on the program. We also conducted in-depth interviews with the grassroots educators, and they provided important information about the activities that they were undertaking and the challenges that they were facing. In the initial phase, the grassroots educators were holding in-person meetings, they were going to fairs, they were doing canvassing, and they were really reaching a lot of low-income households that could potentially participate in the program. Some of the challenges that they mentioned at the time were that there were not enough approved vendors in the area that they were serving, and there were not specific projects under development yet that they could refer their participants to. As the evaluation progressed, the grassroots educators began to face challenges due to COVID, and they started to hold their education activities mostly via webinars. And that was definitely challenging for them to reach participants, but they found success in partnering with other organizations that were providing services to low and moderate income households. Beginning with the phase 2 evaluation, we spent a lot of time speaking with the approved vendors. We conducted in-depth interviews with many of the approved vendors, both those who had submitted and selected projects, as well as those who had not. And we also conducted a quantitative survey with the approved vendors. The approved vendors provided important information on the challenges that they faced in the program. Some of the most important barriers that they mentioned were financing, the extensive requirements that they faced in the program, the administrative burden, uploading documents to the portal, redundant documentation that was required, and finding solar-ready homes for the distributed generation sub-program. With respect to construction, they faced barriers due to the pandemic, to weather, and obtaining the permits that they needed for the program. The approved vendors recommended synthesizing the information that's available on the program to give them a better understanding, improving the portal, and also improving the program website. The approved vendors also provided a lot of positive feedback about the support that they received from Elevate Energy. In the final in-depth interviews that we conducted with the approved vendors, we found that Elevate provided implementation assistance to 18 of the 19 approved vendors that we interviewed, and they all said that Elevate was extremely helpful and responsive to their requests for assistance. We also conducted in-depth interviews with participants in the grassroots education. We had initially planned to speak with program participants, but there were not sufficient program participants at the time. So we instead spoke to participants in the grassroots education. What we found from those interviews was that the grassroots education participants were not really getting the key messages of the program, in that they did not understand the benefits that could be provided to them from the program. They were still very concerned about the costs and were they going to benefit. And they did not understand that they could participate in community solar without having a suitable roof or without being a homeowner. So we found that there was some room for providing a more concise and targeted message to those participants. For the final evaluation report, we also conducted in-depth interviews with electric utilities in Illinois, and they provided an understanding of the benefits of increased solar to the grid and the barriers to providing coordination between Illinois Solar for All and the electric utility low and moderate income energy efficiency program. As part of the final evaluation, we also spoke to some job trainees, individuals who participated in the job training, and some of whom worked on Illinois Solar for All projects. The job trainees faced some challenges because they were working at the same time they were going for the training. They faced some challenges in commuting to the training location when it was not located near where they lived. However, the job trainees did speak very positively about the opportunities that the training provided, and several noted that the salaries that they were earning as part of solar work were much higher than what they were earning before. And in the final evaluation report, we also present findings from interviews with state low-income distributed generation program managers. We conducted these interviews to get a better understanding of the challenges faced in other states and how those states overcame those challenges to enroll low and moderate income households in the program. And we also conducted in-depth interviews with Green Bank program managers around the country in anticipation of the new legislation and the possibility of a green bank helping to support the Illinois Solar for All program. Another important part of the evaluation research was data analysis, and I'll be presenting some of the key findings from the data analysis in the next upcoming slides. We analyzed program data on the approved vendors and the projects and the participants. We also analyzed American Community Survey data to develop an understanding of the areas where the installations were made and the characteristics of the participants or potential participants in Illinois. We conducted additional data analysis to assess the impact of Illinois Solar for All on job creation and economic output, on environmental impacts, and equivalent impacts from the program. The evaluation also provided an assessment of the program administrator, looking at all of the different areas that the program administrator was responsible for and assessing how well those areas were addressed. This is the second stakeholder presentation on the evaluation. The first one was done at the beginning of the phase 2 evaluation. So that's an overview of the evaluation research that was conducted. And if you're interested in a lot of detail on any of those activities, you can find them in the evaluation reports that I referred to earlier. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so next I'll be talking about the program metrics. Before I get into the metrics, are there any questions about the overview of evaluation research that I provided so far?
We don't have anything in the chat so far.
Okay, let's move on to the metrics. The data that I'm going to be presenting here are as of April 2021. The slide shows that there were 58 approved vendors. 8 of those vendors are minority and women business enterprises, and that's increased up to 9 with the sale of one of the approved vendors to an MWBE firm. 30 approved vendors submitted projects, and 20 approved vendors had selected projects within the first 3 program years. This slide also presents information on the selected and Part 2 approved projects. So these selected projects are all of the projects that were selected in the first 3 program years as of April 2021. And the Part 2 approved projects are approved to be invoiced by approved vendors for constructed projects. And you can see that there was a total of 116 selected projects and 25 Part 2 approved projects by April 2021. Next slide, please. This slide presents information from the program database on projected capacity and production from the first 3 program years. The total KW capacity for the first 3 program years is over 22,000 KW, and the total megawatt hours of production annually is over 53,000. And the slide also presents the data both by program year and by subprogram. Next slide, please. This slide presents information on the REC dollars. On the left side, you can see the REC value in environmental justice communities and low-income census tracts from program years 1 through 3. For the nonprofit and public facility subprogram, 63% of the REC dollars were in environmental justice communities. From the community solar projects, 83% of the REC value was in environmental justice communities. And for the distributed generation, 8% of the REC value was in EJ communities. And the reason that it's low for distributed generation is that there was one large DG project that was not in an environmental justice community. But the additional funding for that subprogram will be spent so that at least 25% will be in environmental justice communities. The slide also shows that overall, 69% of all REC dollars were in EJ communities. The other thing that you can see in the left-hand chart is that almost all of the REC value was in low-income census tracts. On the right side of the slide, you can see the total REC value for program years 1 to 3 in each of the subprograms, and overall, the total REC value as of April 2021 was $51.8 million. And for the Part 2 approved projects, it was $8.1 million. Next slide. One of the indicators that was required to be developed was the cost per kilowatt hour. So this slide shows all of the costs that went into the program in each of the first 3 program years and overall, and then the computed cost per kWh produced over a 20-year solar lifetime. So you can see that the cost in the first program year was 7 cents per kilowatt hour. In the second year, it was 8 cents. In the third year, it was 4 cents. And the average over the 3 years was 6 cents per kWh. Next slide. This slide presents information on the energy impacts and other impacts of Illinois Solar for All. First, we look at the participant energy burden. We wanted to look at the impact of Illinois Solar for All on the energy burden of participants. When we analyzed the data, there were only a small number of participants. The specific participants that we're looking at are those that were in the single and multifamily distributed generation subprogram. The community solar had not had information on participants yet. The data that were collected from the program do include information on the projected annual cost reduction for program participants. However, the data does not include information on households' energy costs. So in order to compute the reduction in energy burden, we use the American Community Survey data on household energy costs for Illinois for low and moderate income households. And using those data, we calculated that the program reduced mean energy burden from 6% of income to 2.7% of income for single family participants. Another issue that the evaluation was directed to look at was whether domestically produced panels were used, cost differences between domestic and foreign panels. This information was collected through the quantitative approved vendor survey. And the approved vendors reported that the domestically produced panels were between 7 and 50% more expensive than the foreign produced panels. 4% of those who we surveyed did not expect to use foreign panels. 36% did plan to use foreign panels, but because of the stage that they were in with their project, 60% still were unsure about what panels they were going to be using. The evaluation also looked at the electric distribution system and the impact of the program on that system. This information was based upon interviews with the electric utilities, and they reported that increased solar production leads to better sustained voltage because it's closer to end users. And this is the increased solar production, not only from Illinois Solar for All, but also from the adjustable block program. The electric utilities also reported that the increased solar production can help to fill the generation void from the retired coal plants. Other impacts that we looked at were economic impacts. We estimated $40.8 million increase in output and 265 increased job years from the lifetime impact of the first 3 program years. We also estimated the environmental impacts based upon the current fuel mix in Illinois' grid. And we estimated a $66.5 million value from reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, SOx, NOx, particulate matter, and volatile organic compounds reductions. And this is also the lifetime impacts of the first 3 program years. We looked at job training based upon the affidavits that the approved vendors submitted. At the time of the evaluation, there were 107 job trainee affidavits submitted. This represented 12 approved vendors, 63 projects, and 33 unique individuals. And the trainees in our interviews did report positively on their training and the work that resulted in the Illinois Solar for All program. Next slide. Another aspect of the evaluation that was requested by the stakeholder groups was to look at the equivalent impacts from the Illinois Solar for All program. So this slide presents some of those impacts. This is based on lifetime production of electricity expected from the Illinois Solar for All project selected in the first 3 program years. And that production is equivalent to any of the following: 90 billion iPhones charged, 7.97 billion cubic feet of natural gas burned, 606,000 tons of coal burned, almost 191,000 cars taken off the road for 1 year, over 100,000 homes powered for 1 year, over 107 million gallons of gas consumed, 2.04 million barrels of oil consumed, and 13.9 million trees planted over a 10-year growth period. And the evaluation report provides a lot of detail on how these equivalencies were calculated. Next slide. Okay, next I'm going to move to the recommendations, but before I go over those, were there any questions about the evaluation findings that I presented so far?
Yes, we did have one question in the chat. When you used demographic data from the ACS to find energy burden, was that specific to the census block and zip code of the recipient, or was it a statewide number? And I can unmute if we need to ask further.
It was a statewide number for the LMI households that would be eligible for the program. Okay, and I can elaborate on that if there's future questions later, but I'll go into the recommendations now. I'll start with the program design recommendations. So the first recommendation is to assess and streamline distributed generation program requirements. Reduce the redundancies in the documentation that's required from the approved vendors. Reduce the batch requirements for the first set of distributed generation projects to make it easier for approved vendors to participate. And reduce the waiting period between disclosures and contract execution. The next is to limit the program changes. So over the time that we were evaluating the Illinois Solar for All program, there were several changes that were implemented as there were learnings from the program and as there was a new revised program plan. And those program changes took a lot of time to be implemented by Elevate to revise the portal and to revise the project selection guidelines. So this recommendation is to focus program changes on reducing distributed generation project development and participation barriers, and to really allow the program administrator to focus on streamlining project development and the implementation process, and increasing implementation of distributed generation projects. The third program design recommendation relates to a plan for a green bank, and the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act of 2021 includes a provision to create a green bank. And several of the approved vendors mentioned that one of the challenges was the financing and the lack of project financing and the need to put up funds up front to get the projects implemented. So this recommendation is to plan how green banks can aid approved vendors in project financing. Next slide. So next, we provided recommendations with respect to partnerships and coordination. For the weatherization agencies, we recommend that the program work with community action agencies to screen for program eligibility during WAP service delivery. One of the barriers that we talked about earlier were the challenges in finding LMI households who have homes that are suitable for solar. So if the WAP agencies could screen for program eligibility and home suitability during their service delivery and could provide those households to the program, that would save a lot of resources for the approved vendors to reach out to many homes in order to find one that would be suitable for solar. Have the community action agencies provide lists of WAP participants who are good candidates for the distributed generation sub-program. And I think that there is some language in the new legislation that maybe can provide for easier data sharing to allow this to happen. implement a process to work collaboratively with the community action agencies. So that's for the program administrator to work collaboratively with the community action agencies, and provide training to the CAAs where needed. So some of these CAAs may need training to do that solar readiness assessment. And I think that's something that the program could provide to facilitate the DG implementation. Another recommendation relates to other low-income programs, and that's to identify other low-income programs that can identify potential distributed generation participants. And two examples are Habitat for Humanity and the Chicago Porch and Roof Replacement Program. And the next recommendation relates to the utility low-income programs. And when we conducted in-depth interviews with the utilities, we found that there were barriers to this type of coordination. And this is another area that is stressed in the new legislation. Our recommendation here is to assess how this coordination could be implemented in the future. And maybe there's a potential for additional legislation that could specify specifically how the utility low-income programs could be better coordinated with Illinois Solar for All. And also that this may require specific funding for project development. Next slide. The next area of recommendations relate to program implementation. The first one is proactive assessment and planning. The program administrator had a large challenge in implementing the complicated Illinois Solar for All program and was successful in implementing several project submission and selections over the time that we were evaluating the program. However, their focus throughout was really to put the procedures in place that needed to be put in place to run the program and to add on new elements as they were added to the program or as changes were made. So the recommendation is to assess how to design procedures to create efficiencies and to remove redundancies, and work ahead of the current implementation steps to really think proactively about how the program can be implemented most efficiently. Next, with respect to stakeholder and partner engagement, implement proactive outreach beyond the current email blasts to really increase the engagement of organizations that serve low-income households. Because when we were conducting outreach to non-participating stakeholders, we found that some of these organizations did not have the information needed to participate in stakeholder engagement. Next, with respect to approved vendor and participant outreach for the distributed generation sub-program, the recommendation is to conduct outreach to approved vendors to develop more offers. One of the really positive aspects of the program was that the program administrator developed offer sheets so that potential participants could compare different offers that approved vendors have. And our recommendation is to continue to increase the number of offers that are available. And also to reach out to low-income energy program participants to provide education about these offers. With respect to marketing, the recommendation is to improve the website design to make it easier to find information and improve the marketing materials to convey information in a simplified manner. The program administrator did put together really helpful information about case studies of participants who had solar installed at their homes. But we found that some of the information really should be simplified to make it easier for potential participants to understand what was involved, what would be involved in participating and what their potential benefit could be. When we spoke to the job trainees, we found that there's a need for additional programs outside of the Chicago area. So we're recommending to qualify additional programs. And with respect to project submission and approval, review and streamline the process wherever possible and reduce the burden of the Part 2 approval process. Next slide. So that is the end of the presentation that I have prepared, and I look forward to any questions you have.
So we did have one question. It refers to maybe 2 or 3 slides back. The question was regarding what you meant that by that specific funding could be required in order to facilitate partnerships with utility low-income programs.
I'm referring to funding for the utilities to give them the resources that they need to implement those partnerships. So if there was greater coordination, the utilities would have to have staff that were available to answer questions about the programs, to coordinate with the Illinois Solar for All, maybe to provide additional training to the individuals who go to their homes to do assessments so that they could do assessments of solar readiness at the homes. So I'm proposing that the utilities would need funding to implement this type of coordination.
Thank you. And Kim, if you need further elaboration, just let us know. The next question was if there are plans to interview participants for future evaluations. I think I might be able to at least touch on that. Right now, Apprise is completed the phase 1 and phase 2 evaluations. And at this time, when there are future evaluations, that will be there will be stakeholder feedback on that. I'm reading question. So one participant says that there was a disconnect between potential and existing approved vendors and the entity responsible for making contact and disseminating information necessary to participate. What are your recommendations specifically how to solve that?
So the question is how to make sure that potential vendors have the information that they need to participate in the program?
That's what I'm gathering.
Okay. Well, I think that some of the recommendations that we got when we talked to the approved vendors, as well as through our own review of the materials, is that the information really needs to be synthesized and summarized and presented in a manner that's easier to understand. For example, one of the specific recommendations that we made was to provide a summarized list of steps that approved vendors needed to take to submit a project. And that is something that Elevate came out with later in the program implementation. I think that additional summaries of information needed, for example, a summary of what steps an approved vendor needs to take a solar vendor needs to take to become an approved vendor would also be very helpful.
Okay. Our next question on slide 14. Could you describe the process of how an application goes from selected to Part 2 approved, and why is there a huge gap in some of those categories? And it's asking if the projects are failing or have incomplete questions or what.
Okay, so from selected to Part 2 approved is the entire process of developing the project, constructing the project, getting all of the permits needed, getting all the mid-level approvals from the program administrator, and then having the final inspection and having that approved. So, and for a community solar, that would also involve getting the subscribers engaged in the program. So there's a lot of work for the vendor to do in constructing and getting the project approved. And that takes a long time. When we talk to the approved vendors, they said from start to finish of a project, it ranged from 6 months to 3 years. And the midpoint of that was 1.5 years. I think that part of the length was due to COVID and the challenge in recruiting subscribers. And hopefully that's something that will become shortened, both as communication and outreach become easier with the end of COVID, and as the program administrator continues to work on streamlining the process.
Okay. Next question was, could you lay out the geographic location of projects?
There is a map in the evaluation report that talks about, that shows on the map exactly where each of the projects are. We also provided analysis in the report about where the projects are with respect to urban, rural, and suburban areas, and how the REC dollars are distributed across those areas. So there's a lot of detailed information on that in the evaluation report.
Next, how are grassroots education participants identified, and how was this data collected and the number of participants?
So grassroots education data were provided from the grassroots educators. They provided information to us on individuals who provided information to them when they attended the education events. And that was one of the challenges that we had in conducting the research, that there were not data on all of the participants. Only a small number of the participants had data available. And even those who did, the information was mixed. Some only had addresses, some had phone numbers, some had email. So we worked through whatever method we had to get in touch with those participants.
Thank you. And earlier you said the lack of financing for low-income distributed generation for repairs before solar could be installed. And the person was asking if the Green Bank would help with this problem.
I think that maybe is a potential, but I think that for LMI households, it's really going to be a challenge for them to undertake those kinds of projects. For example, if they had to replace the roof, that could be a $20,000 job. And I don't know that the LMI household would undertake that kind of a project.
I think that is all for the questions that we have so far. Laura Oakleaf, who's the senior program manager at Elevate for Illinois Solar for All, put the link of the active map of projects. So that's the map that is updated regularly. That link is in the chat. We have another question: were the job training project installation goals met?
Yes, they were. For the job trainee affidavits that were submitted, they did meet the requirements for the job training.
It appears Kim Knowles has a question. Okay, Kim, you can unmute.
Hi, Jackie. I was just trying to say that I think when Ben Paulos was asking the question, I think he was asking a different question, and if not, I have the question also. I think he was saying, like, between when you show the numbers of the part 1 and then the part 2, there's this huge gap. So what's accounting for those projects that drop off? Are they still in the pipeline, or That's why he was asking, like, did they not
Right.
get approved?
No, those are not, the difference is not that those projects dropped out. They just have not reached that phase of implementation yet. Because of the long time period that it
Okay.
takes for projects to reach phase part 2 approval, those projects are being developed, and any of the projects that had dropped out, we removed from the number of selected projects. So the difference between the numbers of selected and part 2 approved are just those projects that are currently being developed or inspected or on some stage along that path.
Oh, okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions before we wrap it up? All right. I think one more thing to mention, I think Jackie probably covered this when she was covering about the delays between part 1 and part 2. One thing that we are seeing a lot is energization delays. So there is a scheduled energization date for these projects. And if there are delays to completion of development, they're allowed to submit for extension requests. And so we've been seeing those and working with vendors and as they've been having those challenges. But for the vast majority, they are just extension requests and not necessarily drop-offs of projects or removals. Just wanted to mention that before we wrapped up. But anyway, so that concludes our webinar today. I really want to thank Jackie Berger for presenting this and for leading us through these evaluations. And we have a lot of great information to think about as we go into our plan update.
Thank you very much, Jen, and thanks everybody for your participation.
All right, with that, we will end our webinar.